What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I'm going to discuss my top 10 greatest fighters of all times. Now, I have done a video on this once before, and the fighters have not changed. However, I will go into more depth as to why they are my top 10 greatest fighters and why I have selected them in the order in which they have been selected. Now, I'm not going to do the traditional countdown. I'm going to get right into my number 1, and I'll go up forward to number 10. I'll be choosing one video per fighter, but I'll do 2 videos per day. So by Friday, I would have completed my top 10. So those who know me and know my channel know that my number 1 greatest fighter of all times is Sam Langford. But I'm going to go into further depth as to why Sam Langford is my greatest number 1 fighter of all times. He had the greatest career in all of boxing. That cannot possibly be disputed. The only thing Sam Langford has not proven is that he could become a world champion. And the reason that is the case is because he was denied by every champion in every weight division from 1900s. And I'll say hundreds because he began his professional career in 1902, specifically 1903. And he ended it in 1925. And he was denied by every champion outside of Joe Gans and Joe Walcott. So let's talk about Sam Langford. Why is he so special as far as I'm concerned? And I'm not alone. You have many historians and those who study the game of boxing for many years will concur with me. Of course, they have their own specific reasons and criterias. But at the end of the tunnel, we all come up with the same fighter. Now, Sam Langford, I'm going to go through his catalog of names. I must do that so you can understand what Sam Langford had to deal with and the time in which he came. And you'll always hear me. The only way you can properly judge a fighter, number 1, his career has to be completed first. Number 2, you have to look at a man in which the time that he came. Because there's certain things that he could not do, he couldn't get away with, he didn't have control over. Sam Langford is no different. Sam Langford, just to give you somewhat of an idea of what he had to deal with and the time in which he came. He was in the back of a wagon, burlap bag overhead, traveled 5 miles. And the wagons during that time didn't have shocks, didn't have springs. They had red clay bumpy roads and backwoods. Well, he had to travel in that condition the entire time. And when he got to a ring, he saw a man hanging. And when he got there were 2 men on horses, one on one side of the ring and one on the other side of the ring. And Sam Langford didn't know whether the man hanging was supposed to win or he was supposed to lose the fight. And the men that were on horses had shotguns. Now, Sam Langford had close to 500 fights. A lot of the fights and the examples that I just explained to you are not documented on your average research or record book. But that's just a tiny example of what Sam Langford had to deal with. He didn't have a man in his corner. You see, they would lock you up if a black fighter had a man in his corner during that time. He didn't have a water bottle. And Sam Langford had to go up into that ring with that mindset of not knowing how to play the game. And that happened to him and many black fighters many a times. Joe Walcott, the Barbados Demon, was in that situation. Joe Gans, the great lightweight champion from Baltimore, was in that situation. As was Jack Johnson and Peter Jackson and many of them. So Sam Langford, his name was Samuel Edgard Langford. He was born 1886, Weymouth Falls, Canada, Nova Scotia. Now, many enthusiasts and authors have various dates of Sam Langford. Clay Moyer, very respectful and respectable author, who I pay close attention to. Has Sam Langford in 1886. Nat Flasher has Sam Langford born in 1880. And I can go on and on with the authors who have different dates of Sam Langford. But I respect Clay Moyer, and I go by 1886. He was known as the Boston Tar Baby. And I have to explain that to you because that's what he was named. And there's various names of black fighters that had the name Black or Darky or Tar Baby or Dirty in it. So the Boston Tar Baby was one of the names that was given to Sam Langford. It's also known as the Boston Terror, the Boston Black, the Boston Bone Crusher, Black Tarzan. And I'll end with that. So at least 10 other names. I believe you have the picture. He died January 12th, 1956 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Now, Sam Langford was abused as a young boy. He had a mind of his own, got into a little devious trouble, but he was a young boy. And his father would abuse him. He would beat him and make him do odd jobs, overwork him when he's 9 years old, 10 years old. So at the age of 14, decided to run away from home. And he would have various jobs as he would work his way towards Boston. Sam Langford was an ox driver, but he would stand behind oxes, or cattle, if you will. And he would have to churn the soil. And we're talking sometimes 5 miles or 10 acres of property. "14-year-old, 15-year-old. He would clean the decks on ships. And I mean, hands and knees, scrubbing with a brush. This kind of labor. He stood 5'6.5" Some state 5'7". He had a 74-inch reach. He was a featherweight and fought up to heavyweight. Weighed 126 to 185 pounds. Fought from 1902 to 1925. Then officially complete his career into 1927. 24 years involved in this sport that was not kind to Sam Langford. He was in the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. He had a manager by the name of Joe Woodman, who would wind up in the Lenox Athletic Club. He would become a custodian. And he would spar with a fighter one day as he was watching on, with broom in hand. He was asked to step into the ring and spar. Now, Joe Woodman was not in the gym at the time. Sam Langford was surprised that he was even asked. He was more nervous about getting in the ring than sparring with the opponent. See, because Sam Langford had no problems using his hands, because of the abuse of his household, because of the way he was raised, and his demeanor. The fact that he was a young boy traveling from another country and found his way to America. That certainly wouldn't bother him. And he would climb through those ropes. He was more worried about what he was going to do to the sparring partner because of the repercussions of that than anything else. But he would wind up knocking that man out in one round. Because the mindset that Sam Langford had. Now I'm showing you this picture because Sam Langford has both hands in his pocket. He's to your far right. And a man who's to his right and to your left is Jimmy Walsh. Jimmy Walsh was a bantamweight champion. And they all lived in Boston. And as you can see here, it's the training quarters for Sam Langford. This picture was taken in 1908. Now, Sam Langford had won the Colored World Middleweight Championship from Roughhouse Ware, the European Middleweight Championship that Roughhouse Ware had won and had owned. He would win the Australian Heavyweight Championship belt. He would win the Mexican Heavyweight Championship belt. Now, Sam McVeigh was the Australian Heavyweight Champion. And Sam Langford would get that title from him. He would be a 5-time colored heavyweight champion. He was the only fighter in boxing history, black or white, to fight the first black lightweight champion in Joe Gans, 1903. The only fighter, black or white, to fight the first black welterweight champion and the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott, fought him in 1904. The only fighter, black or white, to fight the first black middleweight champion. Now, at that time, Theodore Tiger Flowers was not the middleweight champion yet. This fight took place in 1922. But he would become the first black middleweight champion. Sam Langford faced him. And by the way, Flowers would become middleweight champion in 1926 when he would defeat Harry Greb. And at that point, he would become the first black middleweight champion. But Sam Langford faced him in 1922. Got rid of him in 2 rounds. Be the only fighter, black or white, to fight the first black heavyweight champion, 1906. He would take on Jack Johnson. The only fighter, black or white, to fight the second colored light heavyweight champion, the first colored heavyweight champion. We're talking about Kid Norford, and we're talking about Lee Anderson. Defeated them all, except for Jack Johnson. And he was looking to get a second shot that was promised to him with Jack Johnson, and he never got. You see, when he faced Jack Johnson in 1906, 2 weeks before that fight with Johnson, he took on Joe Jeanette. He defeated Joe Jeanette in 15 rounds. He broke his hand in that fight. There was no way in the world he was going to cancel the fight with Jack Johnson, because that was a golden opportunity. And he came up short. He was dropped in the 9th and in the 6th round. Uppercuts and short left hooks. Sam Langford wound up going the distance with Jack Johnson when he was just a junior welterweight 3 years before that, when he took on Joe Gans in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Joe Gans, within 24 hours before facing Sam Langford, took on a Philadelphia fighter by the name of Dave Holly. And Joe Gans took a 300-mile trip from Philadelphia to Boston to take on the Boston Bone Crusher, Sam Langford. But that's how boxing was during those years. And Sam Langford fought under those conditions. He would win the featherweight championship as an amateur in Boston. And what was incredible about Sam Langford? He looked for every competitive challenge that one man can find. He was in the ring with Joe Gans, Joe Walcott, young Peter Jackson, Jeff Clark, the Joplin Ghost, Jack Johnson, Joe Jeanette, Harry Wells, Dixie Kid, battling Jim Johnson, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, Klondike Haynes, Sam McVeigh, Stanley Ketchel, Ed Gunboat Smith, Dave Holly, Fireman Jim Flynn, Theodore Tiger Flowers, Kid Norford, Larry Temple. A remarkable fighter. with Sam Langford. How remarkable, you ask? 1903 alone. He was in a ring with Andy Watson 3 times. Had a total of 34 rounds with him. Bob Stonewall Allen twice, 13 days apart. Danny Dwayne. Now, who was Danny Dwayne? Danny Dwayne was in a ring with Andy Watson and Cub White, Joe Gans, Patsy Sweeting, and Dave Holly. He had 3 prearranged draws that year alone. 2 with Andy Watson. And he had one with a fighter by the name of Billy Jordan. Now, the prearranged draws was if you didn't get knocked out, you would split the purse if it went to a draw. And Sam Langford fought under those conditions. Now, it worked out for him. It worked out for his opponent. But it was a draw. He was in the ring with Harry Wills 22 times. 127 rounds with him. Between May 1st, 1914 and January 27th, 1921. He faced Joe Jeanette 14 times. 180 rounds with him. Between December 25th, 1905, September 14th, 1918. He was in the ring with Battling Jim Johnson 11 times, 120 rounds, between August 22nd, 1918 and May 14th, 1910. Was in the ring with Jack Blackburn 6 times, 59 rounds, between December 9th, 1905 and October 7th, 1905. 1 year alone. Was in the ring with Peter Jackson. That's young Peter Jackson. Larry Temple. Larry Temple was a very underrated fighter. He was the creator of the Bolo Punch. That's where it came from. Larry Temple. Then Seferino Garcia would take credit for it. Then you have Willie Reddish from Philadelphia, light heavyweight. You would have a fighter by the name of Bobby Green, who was a featherweight from Philadelphia. You had Kid Gavilan, who was known as the Cuban Hawk. You had Miguel Barrios, bantamweight fighter from Puerto Rico. But the Bolo Punch would begin with Larry Temple. Now, Bo Jack had perfected it. But Kid Gavilan was a master at it. But he started with Larry Temple. Dixie Kid and fireman Jim Flynn. February 11th, 1903. The Oxnard, California strike would for the very first time would establish a union with different races. But those from the black community did not join unions until at least 1910. February 14th, 1903. The Census Bureau was linked with the Department of Commerce and Labor. March 2nd, 1903. Martha's Washington Hotel was designed for the sole purpose of women in Manhattan, New York. February 15th, 1903, the first teddy bear was created. May 16th, Luna Park, Coney Island, was opened to the public, 8:05 p.m. that evening. October 1st, 1903, the first National League, Pittsburgh versus Boston, was American League, was played. Now, in November of that year, Maggie L. Walker was the first black woman to charter a bank. December 19th, 1903, Williamsburg Bridge from Delancey Street of Manhattan to Randall's Island was open. All these things took place in 1903. At the time was Sam Langford. Was making a lot of noise in boxing. So much so that the light heavyweight was created. Because Jack Root was a middleweight. And Joe Woodson, who was the manager of Sam Langford, made offers to Jack Root. Almost to the point where Jack Root was humiliated. And he would move up to the brand new light heavyweight division that was created for him, specifically for him, because it was his manager. His manager was also a newspaper writer. And he made it happen. And Sam Langford was supposed to be one of the fighters to be in that mini tournament. And they rejected him and they replaced him with a fighter by the name of Charles Kid McCoy. And on the other side, George Gardner took on Marvin Hart. Marvin Hart was challenged by Sam Langford, and Marvin Hart refused to fight Sam Langford. So he got the opportunity to take on George Gardner. George Gardner would defeat him. And so now George Gardner and Jack Root would meet each other. And George Gardner would come out on top and he would become the new light heavyweight champion. But Sam Langford was denied of that opportunity. What's remarkable about Sam Langford, once again, the time in which the man came. He challenged the Sullivan brothers, Mike and Jack, offered them winner take all, offered to fight them both in the same day. And they both refused. But Stanley Ketchel would become the middleweight champion when he would defeat the Sullivan brothers. Sam Langford was not given that opportunity. He would finally get an opportunity to fight a middleweight champion, Stanley Ketchel. But it was a 6-round no decision, prearranged fight. But he was promised an opportunity with Stanley Ketchel for the World Middleweight Championship. And Stanley Ketchel had honored that. Unfortunately for Stanley Ketchel, he'd be shot after the Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries fight by Walter Dipley. So once again, Sam Langford would not get his opportunity. 1909, Jack Johnson, who would become the heavyweight champion in 1908 in Sydney, Australia, by defeating Tommy Burns, had appointed Joe Jeanette and Sam McVeigh for his colored heavyweight title. But Sam Langford was promised that opportunity, and he was denied. And what was supposed to happen, the first time Sam McVey and Joe Jeanette faced one another, it was a boring 20-round bout. But because of the customers being dissatisfied, he would give them a second opportunity. And that was the slot that Sam Langford was supposed to fulfill. But it turned out to be a great fight in Paris, France, between Sam McVey and Joe Jeanette, April 17th, 1909. 49 rounds of brutal hell. Sam Langford, all he could do was watch. Sam Langford was in the ring with all of them. And when you examine the conditions, examine his accomplishments, examine the fighters in which he fought, the amount of fights he fought, the amount of rounds he fought, he would travel all over the country as a black man living at a time when he was not appreciated. That, my friend, is why I have Sam Langford, the number one greatest fighter of all times. Oh, he went through it all. Defeated Philadelphia Jack O'Brien in 1911, 6 rounds. In the ring with Fireman Jim Flynn 4 times. In the third fight, he knocked him out cold. Several minutes, Jim Flynn was laid out flat. Kid Norfolk, William Ward, battling Jim Johnson, 11 wins against him. Never lost to battling Jim Johnson, but yet battling Jim Johnson would get a shot at Jack Johnson's crown. And that would be the first time a black champion would face another black fighter for the heavyweight championship belt. What more can I say? Bearcat Wright, Tut Jackson, Jeff Clark, Fred Fulton, Jack Savage, Cleve Hawkins, Fireman Jim Flynn, John Lester Johnson, Big Bill Tate, Roughhouse Ware, Young Peter Jackson, Jim Barry, 12 times I might add, George Godfrey, Ed Gunboat Smith, Lee Anderson, battling Jim Johnson, 15 times, Jack Thompson, Joe Jeanette, 14 times, Sam McVey, 15 times, Harry Wills, 22 times. That's the greatest fighter in boxing history. He had the greatest career. In there with them all, from featherweight to heavyweight. One of the hardest punches in boxing history. Knocked out more